Have you ever felt truly underestimated? Like your unique skills and quiet strength were invisible to a world obsessed with appearances? Imagine being dismissed, even mocked, only for the very challenges you've faced to become the sole key to saving hundreds of lives. This is a story about the unsung hero within us all and how true competence often hides in plain sight, waiting for the moment when courage and quiet expertise must rise above arrogance. Join us as we journey into the heart of a crisis where one woman's forgotten past becomes everyone's only hope. Emily Rhodess, 35, moved through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who'd long ago learned how to disappear into a crowd. Her steps were measured, unhurried. The carry-on slung over her shoulder was plain and utilitarian, her clothes just as nondescript. Slacks, a dark blouse, no flashy jewelry or colors to draw the eye. Nothing in her appearance hinted at the extraordinary skills hidden beneath that calm, unassuming exterior. 7 years ago, she'd been Hawk 22, commander of a combat rescue helicopter squadron in some of the most dangerous theaters on Earth. She'd built a flawless record, carving a reputation as the pilot who could extract wounded Marines from situations no one else dared fly into. Time and again, she'd brought them back alive, her helicopter limping home, riddled with bullets, her hands steady on the stick, even as alarms screamed. Then came that day, the day a sudden mechanical failure during a desperate extraction cost the lives of 3 men she couldn't save. She could still see their faces sometimes. The guilt hollowed her out and drove her from the service entirely, into a kind of quiet exile. Since then, she'd avoided anything that reminded her of who she used to be. Today, she was nothing more than Emily Rhodess, civilian consultant on aircraft maintenance protocols, boarding a routine flight, Denver-bound, Flight 4 Fokker 7, for yet another business meeting. The work was ironic, perhaps even a little cruel. Her days were now spent poring over checklists and advising airlines on proper procedures, all while trying not to think of the times she'd flown combat missions through gunfire and smoke. But it paid the bills, and it kept her tethered to aviation without demanding the weight of command or the risk of more lives on her conscience. She settled into her aisle seat in row 12 and buckled in with practiced efficiency. Out of habit, her eyes swept the cabin as she did, cataloging what she saw like a soldier walking a perimeter. The Boeing 737 seemed to be in good condition, clean lines, no obvious signs of wear. But she felt it immediately as the aircraft began to taxi, a faint but distinct vibration coming from the left engine. Most passengers wouldn't have noticed. Emily did. She told herself it was probably nothing, but some habits, like vigilance, refused to die. From where she sat, she could see through the open cockpit door as the crew conducted their pre-flight checks. Captain Mark Stevens sat in the left seat, First Officer Dave Chen to his right. Both appeared to be in their early 30s, young, fit, confident, too confident perhaps. They worked through their checklists with a methodical rhythm, but their body language carried the easy arrogance of men who'd never had their composure truly tested by a real crisis. When the boarding process slowed, Emily rose quietly, moving toward the front. She leaned lightly against the doorway of the flight deck, waiting until she caught the captain's eye. "Excuse me," she began politely, keeping her tone neutral. "I noticed a slight irregularity in the left engine's vibration during taxi. Might be worth having maintenance take a look before we depart." Captain Stevens barely lifted his head from the instrument panel, his voice clipped and dismissive. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but we've got this under control. Everything's already been checked and double-checked." From the right seat, Chen chuckled without even turning around. "Let me guess," he said, amusement in his voice. "You've been watching those airline disaster documentaries, huh? Don't worry. We know what we're doing up here." Emily kept her voice steady, though her patience frayed at the edges. "I have aviation experience, mostly military helicopters, but—" Stevens cut her off, his lips curling in a smirk. "That's cute. Try not to touch anything important. Ma'am, this is a real airplane." The words struck sharper than she expected, but she managed not to flinch. She'd heard comments like that before, fixed-wing pilots looking down on helicopter crews, dismissing them as second-rate. She met his gaze for half a second longer. then simply nodded, stepping back. She could tell it was useless to press further. As she returned to her seat, she caught the whispered commentary of the middle-aged businessman seated behind her, loud enough for his seatmate to hear, and for Emily. "Guess she thinks watching Top Gun makes her a pilot," he scoffed. "These military wannabes are everywhere." She didn't react, didn't even turn her head. Instead, she focused on the laminated safety card tucked into the seat pocket in front of her. She already knew every step of the emergency procedures for a 737 and a dozen other aircraft besides. But reading through them again gave her hands something to do, gave her mind something to settle on. The captain's mocking tone still rang in her ears. That same tone would echo again, differently, 30 minutes later, when he collapsed forward onto the yoke at 35,000 feet. And when that happened, it would no longer matter what they thought of Hawk 22, because she would be the only thing standing between 200 souls and the long dark fall from the sky. Emily sat quietly in her seat, doing everything she could to calm the edge of pre-flight anxiety that always crept in now, a condition that had taken root after her final military mission, the one that had changed everything. As Flight 447 taxied into position, she leaned back, inhaled slowly, and tried to ignore the familiar, maddening cocktail of excitement and dread that came with being a passenger instead of the one in command. For years, she'd gone out of her way to avoid situations where she might be forced to step back into a leadership role. But today felt different. She couldn't put her finger on why, but something in her gut told her this flight wasn't like the others. The engines began to spool up, the subtle, steady vibration coming through the floor and into her feet as the aircraft prepared to hurtle down the runway. Her instincts, those razor-sharp senses she thought she'd packed away years ago, flickered awake, unbidden. Despite everything, she could still read an aircraft as if it were an extension of her body, and as the big jet thundered into the sky, climbing toward cruising altitude, a faint disquiet settled in her chest. Something was off. 30 minutes later, at cruising altitude, the humiliation began to pile on, just as she'd feared. Emily opened her laptop, pretending to focus on reviewing maintenance protocols she'd kept stored for her own peace of mind, but her concentration kept fracturing. She could hear them behind her, the businessman in the suit, and his seatmate, making sure their voices carried. "These military types," the businessman said with an indulgent laugh, "always think they know everything. Helicopters and airplanes, not even close. That's like saying you can drive a Formula One car just because you've ridden a motorcycle." His companion chuckled in agreement. "Exactly. Airline pilots go through years of specialized training, and then some weekend warrior with a helicopter license thinks he's qualified to give advice to the pros. The audacity." Emily's jaw tightened. She shut her eyes for a moment, willing herself to block them out. She'd been hearing that kind of dismissive tone her entire career. The quiet assumption, sometimes spoken aloud, that helicopter pilots were somehow lesser, that their craft was more toy than machine. What they never seemed to understand was that flying a helicopter demanded an entirely different kind of mastery. Airplane pilots relied on forward momentum and predictable paths, the physics of fixed wings and long runways. Helicopter pilots, on the other hand, lived in three dimensions, thinking and reacting instantaneously, hovering on nothing but rotor wash, holding lives aloft in impossible situations. Emily had flown into Afghan mountainsides under fire to pull wounded soldiers out of impossible terrain. She'd navigated through sandstorms that would have grounded even the most advanced jets. She'd landed with surgical precision in clearings barely larger than the rotor disc itself. None of that mattered, though, not to people who still thought of helicopters as toys. Up front in the cockpit, Captain Stevens and First Officer Chen's conversation drifted back through the cabin, easy to hear over the hum of engines and air. Their casualness grated on her nerves. "Beautiful weather today," Stevens remarked. His tone was light, even bored. "Smooth air, perfect visibility. Days like this make you feel like you're on a paid vacation." Chen gave a dry laugh. "Sometimes I wonder what we're even here for. These modern planes practically fly themselves. Autopilot does everything but serve the coffee." Emily's frown deepened. In her military days, complacency was the enemy of survival. You never let your guard down, not for a second. The moment you got comfortable, the moment you stopped treating the aircraft and the conditions with respect, was the moment something catastrophic happened. That faint vibration she'd felt during taxi hadn't gone away. In fact, it had grown a little stronger. Subtle enough that most passengers and even a lot of pilots wouldn't have noticed. But to her trained senses, the irregular rhythm stood out like a discordant note in a song. Something mechanical was developing. She was sure of it now. The businessman behind her piped up again, his voice a little louder this time. "Look at our little aviation expert," he sneered, gesturing toward her. "Still studying those safety cards like she's cramming for a final exam. Bet she thought that oxygen mask demo was personally for her." A few nearby passengers turned to look. Some smirked. Emily felt her cheeks flush with heat, but forced her expression to remain calm, impassive. She'd endured worse humiliation than this in the field, situations where proving herself wasn't about ego but about saving lives. It wasn't the mockery that unsettled her now. What truly bothered her was the growing certainty, cold and clear in the pit of her stomach, that something was wrong with this plane. Her instincts screamed at her, honed by thousands of hours in some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth, screaming warnings no one else seemed to hear. The vibration beneath her feet intensified just slightly, joined now by the barest, almost imperceptible change in the aircraft's trim. To the untrained eye, it would seem nothing, just a passing shudder, a breath of turbulence. But Emily's mind was already cataloging the symptoms automatically, just as she'd been trained to do. Possible engine mount fatigue, irregularities in the fuel system, maybe early-stage compressor problems. Her eyes open, cold and sharp now. She could feel it deep in her bones. Something was going wrong, and nobody else knew it yet. The situation was far from immediately life-threatening, yet still demanded urgent action. Emily considered stepping up to the cockpit again, but the memory of their dismissive, mocking laughter held her back. They had already made it painfully clear that her concerns were not welcome, and another approach now would only hand those sneering passengers more reason to ridicule her. Earlier, when Captain Stevens had chuckled and told her, "Try not to touch anything important," she had bitten her tongue so hard it nearly bled. Now, watching Stevens casually adjust the throttles with an air of careless confidence, Emily noticed what others would never see. His technique lacked the meticulous precision of someone who truly knew what it was like to fly where every mistake could cost lives. This wasn't combat. This wasn't real danger, to him anyway. Somewhere behind her, someone muttered under their breath, just loud enough for her to hear, "Guess she thinks watching Top Gun makes her a pilot." Emily didn't react. Instead, she dropped her gaze to the safety card in her lap, pretending to study it. In truth, she had already memorized the emergency procedures for dozens of aircraft types long ago. Still, running through the steps calmed her, a ritual she'd clung to ever since her last military mission, which had left her with a tightly wound anxiety she hid from the world. But the vibration growing beneath her seat snapped her back to reality. It was no longer subtle. Something was wrong. Her hands gripped the armrests instinctively as her pilot's instincts screamed in alarm. Around her, the passengers remained blissfully unaware, sipping drinks, flipping through magazines, chatting. Then it happened. A violent shudder ripped through the entire aircraft, as though something enormous had struck them midair. A deafening bang exploded from the left engine. Emergency lights blazed to life, oxygen masks dropped from overhead with mechanical urgency, and the plane lurched savagely to the left, hurling passengers against their restraints. Chaos erupted instantly. Screams filled the air. Luggage fell from overhead bins, thudding and bouncing down the aisle. The acrid scent of panic, sharp and metallic, seemed to fill every cubic inch of the pressurized cabin. From the cockpit came an even more chilling sound, the strangled cry of Captain Stevens, then the dull thunk of his body slamming into the instrument panel. First Officer Dave Chen's voice followed seconds later, cracking under the weight of sheer panic. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, Flight 447, multiple emergencies, engine failure and the captain is down. Unconscious, I don't know what to do." The nose of the aircraft began to dip toward Earth in an uncontrolled descent. Emily could hear it in Chen's voice. He was in over his head. He'd probably never handled a real-world emergency in his life, let alone one with no backup. Without thinking, Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Muscle memory took over, years of military discipline and training replacing the years she'd spent as just another quiet civilian. The same passengers who had chuckled at her earlier now stared at her with wide, desperate eyes. The arrogance that had dripped from them minutes ago was gone, burned away by raw, primal fear. "Get out of my way," she barked at the flight attendant frozen in the aisle, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The first officer can't handle this alone." The attendant stammered, her voice shaking. "Ma'am, you can't. Regulations say—" Emily cut her off with a sharp, commanding tone forged in combat. "Regulations don't matter when everyone's about to die. Either move, or you explain to these passengers' families why you stopped the only person who might save them." The businessman who had earlier mocked her credentials now clutched her arm in panic, his eyes wild. "Wait, you really know how to fly this thing?" Emily stared at him with a hard, steely gaze, her voice flat. "Better than your Formula One analogy suggested." She yanked her arm free and pushed past the stunned flight attendant toward the cockpit, where Chen's frantic voice still poured into the radio, broadcasting his inability to take command. Behind her in the cabin, she could feel all those same passengers, the ones who had laughed at her helicopter experience, silently praying that those inferior skills would somehow be enough to save them, now that their superior airline pilots had failed. When chaos strikes and authority crumbles, who steps up? Real courage, Emily thought, has nothing to do with uniforms, certificates, or applause. It's forged where skill matters more than arrogance, where people act because they must. She shoved the cockpit door open and stepped into hell. The cramped space was awash in flashing lights and blaring alarms. Captain Stevens was slumped forward over the instrument panel, his dead weight pushing against critical controls. Chen sat frozen in his seat, hands trembling so badly he couldn't even keep his grip on the yoke. His wide eyes locked on the blinding warnings flashing red across every display. "Move!" Emily barked, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. She grabbed Stevens under his arms, straining to pull his unconscious body clear of the controls. Chen just stared at her in shock, his mouth slightly open, as though his brain couldn't quite process what was happening. "You can't be in here. Passengers aren't allowed. Your captain is having a medical emergency, and this aircraft is in an unrecoverable dive," Emily snapped, her tone sharp but steady, even as her eyes flicked rapidly between Captain Stevens' slack face and the chaotic instrument panel. She checked his pulse with one hand, the other already reaching instinctively toward the controls. "Do you want to follow regulations?" she added pointedly, her gaze locking on Dave Chen's panicked eyes. "Or do you want to save lives?" Her question cut through his indecision like a blade. Together, they hauled Stevens' unconscious body out of the seat and laid him to the side. Without hesitation, Emily slid into the captain's chair, her fingers curling around the yoke with a familiarity that startled Chen. The Boeing 737 cockpit felt cramped and foreign compared to the military helicopters she'd once flown, but the laws of flight were universal. Lift, thrust, drag, weight. They hadn't changed since the first humans dared the sky. Her eyes swept over the dials, scanning for altitude, attitude, engine output, hydraulics. "What's our altitude? How bad is it?" she asked, already applying gentle pressure to the yoke, fighting the dive with smooth, practiced movements. 17,000 feet and falling fast," Chen stammered, beads of sweat shining on his forehead. "The left engine's completely dead. We're losing hydraulic pressure. I don't—" "Stop talking and listen," Emily cut him off, her voice calm, commanding, carrying the kind of quiet authority forged in combat, the tone of someone who'd led rescue missions under enemy fire. "Key the radio. Tell air traffic control we have a medical emergency and an engine failure, but we're attempting recovery." Her calmness was infectious. Chen blinked, swallowed his fear, and began transmitting, his voice shaky but improving with every word. Meanwhile, Emily assessed their situation with clinical precision. The left engine was gone, no doubt about it, but the right one was still producing steady thrust. Hydraulic pressure was dropping, yes, but it wasn't yet catastrophic. Not yet. They still had options. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Chen's voice crackled over the frequency. "Flight 447 declaring emergency, engine failure, medical emergency. attempting recovery under guidance of qualified pilot. The response from air traffic control was immediate and clear. Flight 447, Roger. Understand engine failure and medical emergency. State intentions and souls on board. Emily reached for the mic herself, her fingers steady, her tone cool and precise. Control, this is Flight 447. We have 203 souls on board. Single engine failure. Captain incapacitated. Requesting vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by. Her voice carried across the frequency with a crisp professionalism that made every controller on duty glance up from their screens. There was no panic, no flailing, only controlled urgency and the kind of radio discipline that betrayed her as far more than just a passenger who'd stumbled into the cockpit. Flight 447, Roger. Turning you left, heading 09er uniform. Descend and maintain 10,000 feet. Nearest suitable airport is Denver International, 43 miles. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Word spread quickly in the cabin behind them. Passengers whispered to each other, some craning their necks to see who was flying the plane now. The businessman who had scoffed at her earlier, mocking her helicopter experience, pressed his face to the window, watching the wings level out and the ground stop its sickening tilt. "She's actually doing it," he murmured to his seatmate, awestruck. The plane's leveling out. Emily didn't even hear them. She worked methodically through the emergency procedures, adapting her military training to the civilian systems with an ease that impressed even Chen. Single-engine approach? Standard. Helicopters drilled auto-rotation landings on a weekly basis, just in case one of their engines quit. She could handle this. "Chen," she said firmly, not even looking at him, "I need you to focus. Run through the single-engine approach checklist. I'll fly, you handle the procedures." Her no-nonsense tone snapped him back into focus. They worked together seamlessly now, and as Chen flipped through the checklist and responded to her adjustments, he found himself stealing glances at her hands on the controls. The way she maintained glide angle and coordinated the turns made it obvious she wasn't just some lucky passenger. Finally, he asked it quietly, almost to himself. Who are you?" Emily didn't look up, simply adjusted the power settings and said, "Someone who's been in worse situations than this." On the ground, in the control tower, Janet Morrison, the air traffic control supervisor, was already pulling up the passenger manifest for Flight 447. Something about the way that woman spoke on the radio, the way she took control, had gnawed at her. What she found on her screen made her freeze for a heartbeat. Then she picked up the phone to her own supervisor. "Sir," she said, her voice low and urgent, "we need to review the passenger list for Flight 447, the person flying that aircraft now. Her name is Emily Rhodess, and according to military aviation databases, she's a former helicopter commander. Combat experience. You an apology on behalf of myself and this airline. We all underestimated you. We shouldn't have ignored your warnings, and we never should have let our own assumptions about you cloud our judgment." Emily listens quietly, her expression calm but unreadable, as if weighing his words and finding no satisfaction in them. She doesn't gloat. She simply nods once and meets his eyes, offering nothing more than a quiet, professional, "Thank you, Captain Stevens." Around the table, the tension is thick as the FAA investigators ask their questions, reviewing the cockpit voice recordings and maintenance logs. Emily answers every one of them with precise, clipped professionalism, her tone never wavering. When pressed on why she insisted on returning to the cockpit despite being brushed off earlier, she replies simply, "Because the aircraft needed me. That's the only reason that matters." Her words land heavily, silencing even the most skeptical executives who shift in their seats and glance down at their notes. The military liaison, a tall man in Air Force blues with silver oak leaves on his shoulders, finally speaks up, his voice carrying an edge of pride. "On behalf of the service, Colonel Rhodess, we're glad to see you haven't lost your edge." Emily gives him a faint smile, just the hint of one, and replies, "You never lose it. You just hope you never have to use it like this." Down on the tarmac, Denver International remains a flurry of activity even as dusk begins to settle over the runways. Passengers disembark slowly, still shaken but alive, their relief written plainly across their faces. Emergency crews pack up their equipment, and journalists already jostle outside the terminal, hungry for a glimpse of the woman who landed Flight 447. Meanwhile, Emily stands alone for a moment at the window of the conference room, watching the lights of the airfield twinkle against the deepening purple sky. Behind her, voices murmur, papers shuffle, but she seems removed from it all. Her thoughts are elsewhere, on the sound of the engine failing at altitude, on the terrified faces in the cabin, on the way her hands instinctively found the controls and remembered every hard-earned lesson from the sand and dust of Afghanistan. She allows herself a long breath, the kind of breath you only take when it's finally over, and feels the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. Yet mixed with the fatigue is a quiet, fierce satisfaction. Not pride, something deeper. The knowledge that when everything fell apart, she was exactly who she had to be. Behind her, someone clears their throat softly. It's First Officer Chen, who steps closer, still looking slightly sheepish, but no longer timid. "Ma'am," he begins awkwardly, I wanted to say you were right about the vibration, about everything. I won't forget what you taught me up there today." Emily turns to him forwardly, studying him for a moment before replying, "Good, because next time it might be you who has to speak up when nobody wants to listen." He nods firmly, as if committing that lesson to memory, and steps back, leaving her alone again. The door to the conference room opens then, and the airline's CEO enters, flanked by two aides. He offers a carefully worded expression of gratitude for her actions, calls her performance exemplary, and mentions something vague about commendations and reviews. Emily listens, nods politely, but doesn't bother to respond beyond a quiet, "Glad I could help." Because deep down she knows what they don't, that she didn't do it for their thanks or their commendations or to prove anything. She did it because that's what you do. When lives are on the line, you act. You don't wait to be asked. As the room begins to empty and the bustle fades, Emily stays where she is, gazing out at the airport lights until the very last rays of sunlight slip below the horizon. She closes her eyes briefly, and Hawk 22, the call sign that once echoed through combat radios and rescue missions, seems to whisper back to her across the years. It reminds her of who she is and why she can never quite walk away. "You deserve far more than just an apology. When you warned us about the engine vibrations, I should have listened. My arrogance could have cost everyone on that plane their lives." Emily Rhodess, Hawk 22, studied the young captain with a quiet calm, her eyes full of understanding rather than judgment. She had seen this kind of guilt before, heavy and sharp as a blade. "Captain," she said gently, "you followed the standard procedures for a passenger concern. The failure here wasn't personal, it was systemic. But maybe it's worth remembering that experience comes in many forms." First Officer Dave Chen, still pale and visibly shaken, but undeniably grateful, nodded in agreement. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Ma'am, the way you handled that emergency, it was like watching a master class. Where did you even learn to fly single-engine approaches like that?" Emily's reply was simple, but it carried the weight of her years. "Afghanistan," she said, "when you're extracting wounded soldiers under fire, you learn to put down an aircraft in conditions that would terrify most civilian pilots. Single-engine approaches become routine when enemy ground fire takes out half your systems." Across the table in the small conference room, the FAA investigator reviewing the preliminary reports looked up from his notes with professional curiosity in his eyes. "Colonel, your radio calls were textbook. Better honestly than most commercial crews I've heard. How long's it been since you flew commercial?" Emily met his gaze without flinching. "Never," she admitted. "All my time is in military helicopters. But the fundamentals of flight don't change from one platform to another. If you understand the physics, not just the procedures, you can adapt." The airline's chief pilot, a grizzled veteran with 3 decades under his belt, sat back and shook his head slowly in quiet amazement. "What you pulled off today," he said, almost to himself, "shouldn't have been possible. A helicopter pilot putting a commercial jetliner on the ground after an engine failure. You're going to change a lot of assumptions in this business." Throughout the debriefing, Emily politely deflected the praise, always steering the conversation back to what could be learned. Her military training had ingrained in her long ago that you don't dwell on your own heroics. You analyze the incident so the next crew doesn't have to rely on luck or instincts to save lives. Hours later, as she gathered her small carry-on and prepared to leave the airport, passengers from Flight 447 continued to find her in the terminal. One of the first was a businessman who, earlier that day, had spent much of the flight mocking her military background under his breath, clearly thinking her concerns were nothing more than a nervous passenger's overreaction. Now he stood awkwardly near her gate with his travel companion. "Colonel Rhodes," he said quietly, his tone humble, his eyes downcast. "I spent 2 hours making jokes about your qualifications, but I want my daughter to know that sometimes the most important people don't look anything like what you expect." Which came a young mother carrying twin toddlers, her eyes wet but bright with gratitude. She stopped Emily with a tentative hand on her arm. "Ma'am," she said softly, I don't know how to thank you. You brought my babies home safe." Emily knelt, lowering herself to the children's level. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Your mom's the real hero," she told the toddlers, meeting their wide-eyed stares with a faint smile. "She stayed calm and helped other passengers. I was just doing my job." The thank yous continued to come throughout the evening, some awkward, some heartfelt, but all sincere. Yet the most meaningful conversation of all came just before her connecting flight, when Captain Mark Stevens caught up to her in the terminal. "Colonel," he began, his voice measured, almost tentative, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened today. Not just the emergency, but my attitude before it all went wrong. And I want to ask you something. Would you consider consulting with us on our emergency training programs?" Emily studied him for a long beat. "Captain," she said carefully, "I'm not qualified to train commercial pilots." "With respect, ma'am," Stevens replied without hesitation, "after today, I think you are more qualified than most of our instructors. We need people who've seen real emergencies, not just simulations." Emily gave a small nod, not committing but not dismissing the idea either. As she finally boarded her delayed flight to complete the business trip she'd originally set out on, she couldn't help but reflect on how quickly life could turn. This morning, she'd been a dismissed, unwelcome passenger whose opinions no one wanted to hear. Tonight, she was being sought out as an expert, someone whose experience might save future lives. As she settled into her seat, the flight attendant, having clearly heard what had happened aboard Flight 447, approached with a quiet reverence. "Colonel Rhodes," she said simply, "thank you for what you did today." Emily responded with just a faint, knowing smile. Experience doesn't always announce itself, she thought as she buckled in. Sometimes it sits quietly, unnoticed, waiting for the moment when it's needed most. In a world obsessed with certificates, titles, and assumptions, real expertise often hides in plain sight, proving itself only when competence matters more than credentials. Emily Rhodess had always grasped a truth that most people never come close to learning. Real skill doesn't announce itself with trumpets or crave applause. It simply is, quiet, steady, unassuming, until the moment comes when it must step into the light. 6 months after the harrowing ordeal of Flight 447, Emily stood at the front of a bright training hall at the National Aviation Training Center, facing a room of seasoned commercial pilots. The same woman who had once been written off as a mere weekend warrior, dismissed by her peers for her military background and lack of airline credentials, now stood here as their instructor, tasked with teaching emergency procedures to the industry's most experienced crews. At her side, Captain Mark Stevens, newly promoted to the role of training coordinator, made a point of introducing her properly each time a new class assembled. His voice carried a certain pride as he told them, "This is Colonel Emily Rhodess, call sign Hawk 22. She saved 203 lives on Flight 447 using skills that, according to the letter of the regulations, shouldn't have even qualified her to touch the controls of the plane she landed." The irony of that fact was never lost on anyone in the room. Now, military helicopter pilots, people like Emily, were being brought in to train commercial airline crews in scenarios that conventional aviation schools had never adequately prepared them for. Under Emily's guidance, they learned not just procedures, but perspective. Her teaching style was precise, yes, but also deeply informed by lessons earned in moments when the checklist ran out and the unexpected took over. Emergency procedures, she often told her students, her calm voice carrying weight across the room, aren't about following a book perfectly. They're about knowing what to do when the book doesn't cover what you're facing. First Officer Dave Chen, now a captain himself thanks in no small part to her mentorship, never missed a chance to credit her influence. She taught me, he'd say quietly but with conviction, that competence isn't about what you've flown or what school you came from. It's about understanding flight itself deeply, fundamentally, so you can fly anything with wings when it matters most. Within the industry, the so-called Hawk 22 protocols began quietly reshaping training programs. These new methods placed real-world emergency experience on equal footing, sometimes even above traditional credentials. Airlines and training centers were beginning to acknowledge something Emily had lived her entire career. True expertise doesn't always come from where you expect, and sometimes the people best equipped to lead in a crisis are the ones who don't fit neatly into the system's boxes. But the most profound change wasn't just procedural, it was cultural. A quiet but growing humility took hold among the next generation of pilots. They began approaching their profession with a new kind of respect, not just for the air and the machines they flew, but for the knowledge of those who had earned it the hard way, without the shine of titles or the comfort of the tradition. Emily still consulted when called. Airlines brought her in to speak at training sessions or to help rework emergency planning. When she stood before these groups, she didn't just talk about stick and rudder skills or the physics of lift and drag. She spoke about something happer, the mindset of leadership when leadership is needed most. Competence, she told one packed conference hall, doesn't wait for permission to act. When everything falls apart, when authority fails, when the checklist has no answer, that's when real experience steps forward. That's when you find out what you're made of. On her consultant badge was a pair of silver wings, not earned through an airline's official program, but through one unforgettable night when skill and courage outweighed credentials. Sometimes she liked to trace her fingers over them as she spoke. Some pilots, she'd tell them with a wry smile, wait for tower clearance before they move. But in an emergency, clearance comes from capability, not paperwork. At Denver International Airport, a small, understated plaque now hangs in the main terminal. It commemorates Flight 447 and pays tribute to all those who prove that expertise doesn't always wear a uniform. It shines with simple words. Courage meets crisis. Skill reveals itself. Because real skill doesn't clamor for recognition. It sits quietly in coach class, listening to the vibrations of an engine that everyone else ignores, waiting for the moment when arrogance collapses and someone finally needs to save the sky. The sky, after all, belongs not to those who merely hold licenses, but to those who truly understand it. Quiet skill doesn't ask for permission. It simply rises when the world needs it most.